And the ACC this year, we talked about it before, could literally be at an all-time low in terms of the big-time postseason tournament, the NCAA field of 68.
The baseline for the Atlantic Coast Conference in terms of getting teams into the NCAA tournament is 1/3 of its membership. So back when it was a 9-team league, yes, there were years where it was only 3 of the 9 got in, although there were also years where 6 of the 9 got in. When it was a 12-team league, the baseline was 4 of 12. This is all in the modern era, right? Since the 1985 expansion of the NCAA tournament to 64 teams, now 68 teams. So a league most known for its traditional and long-term success in men's basketball has had that baseline for 40 years now. At the minimum, you get 1/3 of your teams in. Often you get more than half your teams in. Well, now it's an 18-team league, and we're sitting here in the latter half of February talking about only Duke, Clemson, and Louisville being in comfortable positions to varying degrees about getting into the big dance. 3 out of 18 would be embarrassing. Remember, 1/3 is 6 out of 18, and it certainly doesn't look like the ACC is going to get to that point. How can the ACC turn this around? Well, in the short term, obviously, Wake and Carolina, and we'll see what Pitt does, what SMU does. We'll see if somebody has a magical run waiting for us in the ACC tournament. But the ACC is almost certainly going to fall short of that 6 out of 18 baseline threshold, which would make it its worst by percentage representation in the big dance in the history of the league, at least in this expanded tournament era. How do you turn that around? Long story short is there's 3 things. One is that you need to keep recruiting elite players from the high school ranks and good fits from the transfer portal. If you don't have high caliber players, nothing else matters. And there's a growing emphasis, obviously, on the latter portion of that equation, the transfer portal. I remind folks of this. It sounds simple, but here's the starting point. Arguably the greatest college basketball coach of all time, Mike Krzyzewski. What do his first 3 teams at Duke and his next to last team at Duke have in common? They were not remarkably, stunningly talented rosters, and they all missed the NCAA tournament. 0 for 4. His first 3 and his next to last team in Durham. 0 NCAA tournaments. Yes, coaching always matters, but it matters a lot less when you don't have enough talent, and that rule applies even to the Coach K's and Roy Williamses of the world. Number 2, got to hire great coaches, right? And I'm talking about after this season concludes. Florida State, Miami, and Virginia, all schools that have won either the ACC tournament or the ACC regular season title just within the past decade. All 3 of those have big decisions coming up on their coaching vacancies, with Jim Larinaga already out the door at Miami, Leonard Hamilton saying this is his last season at Florida State, and obviously Tony Bennett retired prior to the season. Ron Sanchez is an interim head coach at UVA. When those 3 programs who have either won the ACC title or made long runs in the NCAA tournament. UVA had a national title under Tony Bennett. Miami had an Elite 8 and a Final Four under Jim Larinaga. Florida State had its greatest long-term stretch of success in its men's basketball program under this Leonard Hamilton guy. Well, they're all gone. And in this league right now, of course, Duke loves John Shire. Clemson appreciates Brad Brelnell more now than ever in his 15 years there. Louisville has made a great hire in Pat Kelsey. Some other guys are only in their first or second year, right? Andy Enfield at SMU, and Kyle Smith is a good coach at Stanford. Mark Madsen at Cal, Adrian Autry at Syracuse, Damon Stoudemire at Georgia Tech, Micah Shrewsbury, I think, is a really good coach at Notre Dame. But they either just got there or they have only been there 2 years. They deserve more time. But here in North Carolina, and I'm talking about beyond the 3 vacancies we already know about, Hubert Davis, 4 seasons almost now at UNC. Steve Forbes, almost 5 full seasons at Wake. Kevin Keats, 8 full seasons almost at NC State. Where do their futures go? The bottom line for the league is when a Carolina hires a Matt Doherty, it hurts Carolina and it hurts the ACC. Mm-hmm. When Carolina hires Roy Williams, it helps Carolina and it helps the ACC. When Louisville hired Kenny Payne, it hurt the ACC. When Louisville hired Pat Kelsey, it helps the ACC. these known vacancies and maybe more unexpected vacancies have to be filled with high caliber head coaches. When this league had Rick Pitino at Louisville, Jim Boeheim at Syracuse, Kay at Duke, Roy at Carolina, and Tony Bennett at UVA, and a lot of other really proven commodities, we didn't have these negative narratives a decade or so ago because the ACC was living up to its reputation as often the best league in all of America. It's only the fifth best league, according to all the analytics right now. Recruiting great players, portal and otherwise, hiring good coaches. And number three, and this is different in the modern era, you got to invest in that men's basketball infrastructure. You have to hire quality general managers. You have to make wise decisions on salary cap management. That is not a phrase we think of in college sports, but if this thing called the House lawsuit settlement in the NCAA is finally approved by a judge, there's going to be 20 plus million in athletic department funds that can be spread among athletes on campus. And I mean, for the first time through the university, through the athletic department. How much of that's going to go to football on campus? How much is going to go to men's basketball? How much is going to go to women's athletes and women's sports with gender equity and Title IX in mind? All these schools have to make these decisions for themselves. Now, I can promise you all 18 ACC schools will spend to that $20 plus million salary capish limit. But I need to remind folks that outside money, the so-called collectives and the other third parties, that is not coming to an end. Even if this new money from inside is permissible under the House settlement, and that it would start this coming fall, you're still allowed to have that third-party money to supplement what these athletes are getting.
Right.
And the schools that do a better job internally and externally in this new world where, yes, it's semi-professional, it'll still be a big part of the equation. That outside money matters, analytics matter, transfer portal specialists matter, player branding specialists matter. All of this stuff adds to your bottom line, and especially when it impacts the first thing I said, which is the ability to attract high-quality players from the high school, junior college, and major college transfer portal ranks. Once you get that elite talent, you have a chance to develop it, in some cases retain it, coach it up, build some chemistry, and hopefully with that combination of more elite players, more good coaching hires, and then the building out of that men's basketball infrastructure and the spending aspect of it all, it should add up, or has the ability to add up, to the ACC getting back to where it was for many, many years. And that's, if not the best league, one of the two or three best leagues in all of college basketball.
Is it intellectually lazy for fans and for clickbait media to point fingers at Charlotte and the commissioner of the ACC, Jim Phillips, and say, hey, he should have been doing something to make a difference in all of this? Because that happened early in the season when this negative narrative about the quality of ACC basketball started to rear its ugly head.
In my opinion, yes. I mean, Jim Phillips is a part of this universe, but Jim Phillips didn't sign the TV deals that left the Atlantic Coast Conference as a second-class citizen behind the SEC and the Big Ten financially. It's not Jim Phillips' fault that attendance at major college football games is simply not as good in the ACC as a whole as it is in the Big Ten and the SEC. It's attendance and TV eyeballs in the sport of football that is driving the economic engine of major college sports. It's not Jim Phillips' fault that the ACC's football culture, going back 70 plus years, is simply not as strong as the football culture in those other two wealthier leagues. Jim Phillips doesn't hire head coaches. Jim Phillips doesn't sign guys out of the transfer portal, right? When the schools we follow, Mike, have made intelligent decisions in the transfer portal, they tend to do well. When they whiff in the transfer portal, they tend to struggle, right? Carolina is a bubble team this year, in part because for the first time in modern UNC basketball history, they don't have a high caliber big man. They're not going to have a big man average even 10 points per game. That has not happened in more than 60 years, 6-0 in Chapel Hill. So roster construction has put Carolina on the bubble more than any other factor You could criticize Hubert Davis. We've talked all season on this show about the weird chemistry among the Carolina guards. It started with poor roster construction. Why is Wake on the bubble despite having four really good players in Hunter Salas and Cameron Hildreth and the App State transfer Trayvon Spillers and the big fella Efton Reed from Gonzaga? Why? Because at point guard, after what was it, 3 years ago, they hit a grand slam with Alondas Williams, who played the best basketball of his life only after he got to Wake. The next year, they hit a home run at point guard with Tyree Appleby of Florida, the guy who played the best basketball of his life only after getting to Winston-Salem. Those both were all ACC players signed and cultivated by Steve Forbes and his staff. Well, last year, Boopy Miller was good, but not quite as good for Wake at point guard. And this year, Tyler Johnson is just way over his head. Not his fault. He's just not ready to be a starting caliber ACC point guard. So despite this amazing collection of four foundational elements, where's Steve Forbes? He's right back on the NCAA tournament bubble because he didn't find the home run, the double, the triple, the grand slam at point guard that he found for
Right.
two of his earlier years. I mean, these things are all connected. And again, Jim Phillips isn't involved in any of these things in a direct manner. Of course, he needs to set the tone. I've even seen situations where commissioners help schools behind the scenes just in communication with head coaching candidates. But man, that's a very secondary role where his job description is much broader, and it's up to these head coaches and these athletic departments at the 18 schools to connect the dots in a much more direct and forceful and impactful kind of way.
Carrie, you've been in those coaches meetings, when you've been the head coach and probably been talking with assistant coaches when you were in a supporting role. That seems like a lot of pressure on coaches to be the ones to take the lead in all of this. I mean, you're more or less worried about your own self. Can you be worried about the macro and not the micro?
In the past, you couldn't afford the opportunity to not be able to do that. You had to be able to do that. And the ones that could do that on both sides generally had success. And a lot of them had success at places that were deemed to be mid-major schools because they didn't have the umbrella of football lingering over them and the pressure of trying to win. They could craft their own way of doing things. They eventually worked their way into higher levels. You look at a guy like Buzz Williams right now is a great example of that. What Shaka has done, they've been able to kind of figure out their own way, their own dynamic style. And now they've been able to go to places where they can make that work, albeit Buzz doing it out of football school at A&M and Shaka at a non-football school at Marquette. Just two different examples that come off the top of my head. I think in listening to David dissect and having been involved in this conference at a very young age, having grown up in the Big East, having traversed the country to go to different Power Six schools, and then eventually sitting in on coaches' meetings at a mid-major basketball conference, if you will, in the West Coast Conference. When you have someone that's in your midst that has a vision of what needs to be and a clear plan of how that can happen as a group, the onus really falls to each individual within that group to take it on themselves to perform to that standard, to implement, to invest. And it's clear the ones that do will rise and the ones that don't will fall. This is just getting magnified on a way bigger scale. Gonzaga was at no fault for what they did in the West Coast Conference. And I remember having conversations with their AD at the time, Mike Roth, and he wasn't, turning his nose up to everyone else. He was just plainly saying, hey, look, this is what you need to do. This is what we did. You don't have to do what we did. Not everyone's school was going to shut down and all of a sudden we made the Elite Eight and we were smart enough to transform our entire campus around this. And now look how we're thriving in the Northwest part of the country, let alone nationally in basketball. But don't complain about anything else that's happening if you're not really investing in what you need to invest in. And as you look at like what's happening now with numbers and finances and just the sheer magnitude of it, it can be very, very overwhelming for a coach. And this is kind of going back to what we physically saw Hubert wearing on his face. It was wearing down on him. I don't think they thought they needed to do it. I think that it was so strong when he came in that it would continue that way. And it's just changed so quickly and so dynamically. And I almost feel like, and I'm curious to get your guys' take on this, as I look at it, all the years of the ACC being a basketball powerhouse conference, of having these dynamic coaches in their own right in that era dominate. Coach K, Coach Smith, to Coach Williams, even when Tony Bennett was inserted into the mix, and you thought he'd be a guy to be here for 20 years. And for all of Coach Boeheim's faults, if you will, he still had something in place that was a known commodity and a way of succeeding that we brought from the Big East into the ACC. The SEC was doing this in football, and basketball kind of had their moments here and there. And obviously, you have the Kentuckys and the Arkansas of the world. But now all of a sudden, they started to realize there's so much finance involved in football. We can replicate the ROI in basketball. And it seems like they made a pointed decision to build off their football prowess and almost mandate to these schools, we need you, or here's your opportunity to invest in basketball. And look what's happened. They've invested in really, really high level coaches. For all of the warts that they have, Bruce Pearl included, already in that conference when he got in trouble at Tennessee, went through a show cause, brought him back. They said, hey, we want guys that can coach, but we also want places that understand how to run an operation. I remember basketball coaches complaining about how many people were in SEC football offices, like it was like their crutch to die. They were going to die on that hill. They got all these guys doing this. They got all these guys doing that. They got 15 guys doing recruiting. I remember when I was at Tennessee, guys, Philip Fulmer had a tail on him, and someone whose sole job was to carry two phones with him behind Philip Fulmer 24 hours a day. And one phone was recruits, and the other phone was someone that had something to do with the business of Tennessee football. And he would scan the call and hand it to Coach Fulmer and say, this is Johnny Jones from Tuscaloosa, the running back. Boom, recruiting call. This is, Mike Williams, our big donor from Chattanooga. Boom. And guys, they were operating at that level in SEC football for years. All they've done is made it a point to do it in basketball. I feel like the ACC, and I'm not one to opine on this from a high level, but just from the outside, never really took a step back and said, hey, basketball has been operating at this high level. We need to kind of mandate that it does that. However it affects football, I'm not really sure. But from a basketball standpoint, it's like they really got caught without a plan, and now they're almost trying to scramble to catch up. And it's no secret that the only place that really had the plan in place, put it in place 3 years ago from a structural standpoint, had a transition from one of those iconic coaches and pillars and Mount Rushmores of ACC coaching into a transition plan that was not 2 or 3 people removed. It was not Matt Doherty, Bill Guthridge, Roy Williams, and now Hubert. It was, this is the guy we found. It's the right time. Coach K remember we talked about this. John had a chance to sit on that bench for a year with no pressure whatsoever to really learn the ins and outs of not really what it meant to coach the team, but to run the program. I'd be really interested to ask him that question if we ever get a chance to, guys. In the year that you sat on the bench in Coach K's last year, just think back on the percentage of time that you spent preparing yourself to be the leader of this program from a coaching perspective and from a CEO perspective. I'd be willing to bet you that it's slightly more on the other side, that it might even it was 55-45. He put more time from himself into running the program than coaching the team, because all of the things that come with coaching the team nowadays have exactly to do with what David just said. This is maybe the best time ever. And you're talking to someone whose sole responsibility at UCLA, when we had to get it back to where it needed to be with Coach Allen, was to recruit talent, to go find in LA and everywhere else, nationwide, wherever, find talent. The best players coupled with really good coaches will always find themselves, and we did for 3 straight years in the Final Four by securing the best possible talent that fit Coach Allen. Now, I think the biggest investment to be made within a staff, yes, someone that can manage that aforementioned $20 million salary cap coming. Yes, someone that can handle the marketing aspect of a Cooper Flag that may go from $4 million to $11 million next year. Is this something we're going to get involved in? Working with his agents. I think it's someone whose sole dedication in the old way of the recruiting coordinator is to manage that portal and work with the chief return on investment officer. We all have to, I remember working in startup and entrepreneurial worlds. Everyone came up with all these chief whatever officers. Well, the one that I think is the chief portal officer and the chief return on investment officer, because they will go hand in hand. And I'm talking about not investment in return for the players, but who's going to help us invest in those players. Where is that going to go back to said people? And how is that going to help us keep this roster intact, whether it's the same players or not, so that that 20 million becomes whatever the unit distribution was. In the old days, it was like, let's get the best teams so we can get the most units so we can get more money back in and have our program be sustainable so the school doesn't look at us in a negative way. So we're at least generating some revenue, which is almost impossible to do without a big football program. Now this is a business, guys. You put astute businessmen in there. You put a dynamic leader who can do one thing right now really well, coach the team. Because at the end of the day, these guys got to do that. But he's also humble enough to put someone or two or three by his side and say, handle this for me, handle this for me, handle this for me, and trust them as if they were in his seat. This is a former head coach. This is a former assistant coach. This is a former high-level businessman operation right now that someone needs to take the bull by the horns and say to the rest of the ACC, don't just say, oh, it's Duke and Duke has $9 million to give to Coach K and they have it. No, it's not just that. You guys have to structure it this way. We can't sit here and complain about net 40, 47, 51, and 58. And if any one of these four teams is going to get in the tournament and jumble numbers up at the end of March, we need to say we're invested in basketball. We're a traditionally basketball-rich conference, but this is a shift we have to make as a group to be able to thrive. And it can't be a knee-jerk reaction to what the SEC did. They just were smart enough a little bit before us. All hope is not lost. It's just time to take a step back and show some dynamic ideas and how we can get the top and the bottom a little bit closer to each other, as opposed to this huge chasm that we're experiencing this year in the ACC.
This is the moment we waited for. Everything you want is right here. We gon' give them what they came for. We gon' take it up from last year. Shoot on my shot, boy, I'm long range. Me and the team on the same thing. Stayed down, never switched up. Only thing changed was the game. I'm in the zone now. Nothing can change what we on now. When I pull up, know it's going down. Foot on the gas, ain't no slowing down. Aiming for greatness, no settling in. Kick down the doors, they won't let me in.